Good morning, folks, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I have elected not to have slides. That's not out of being fundamentally lazy, as my dear past mother might say. It is to avoid the need for technology, but to work, I guess, to the essence of what I do want to pitch to you today, the importance of engaging with your audience, with the people that you represent, in a way that people leave that engagement with some memory of what you've said, with I guess, the ability to have been influenced and feel that sense of connection. To that end, very quickly, if you'll indulge me, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the people that have pulled this conference together for such a large group. Phenomenal job. Really do want to give them a wrap. Look, firstly, if you'll indulge me, I'm 53, just turned 53. I've been married for 30 years to two different women, not at the same time. I have 5 boys, ranging in age from 25 down to 7. And I originally was born in Bourke and moved from the bush when I was 10. Moved to the big smoke, if you like, with mum and dad. One of 7 kids. I guess the history in our family, mum and dad often joke that there's only ever enough food for 5 kids when there's 7, so you had to learn to eat fast or you go hungry. That it might have some connections to why I'm also associated with Food Bank in New South Wales, and I would like to come back to that at the end. It's a very important charity. We were fortunate enough to get John Robertson out of politics in New South Wales, a former opposition leader, and he's the Deputy CEO of that organisation, and that will have some relevance just a little later in the pitch. We are heading into some very interesting times. I've been an IR nerd for a long time. I wasn't a very good student at school. I was a very average footballer, although Macca and I are mates. It's got nothing to do with how well I played football. But I certainly got interested in IR when I was about 12, and I was due to head to Newcastle, or Foster as it was at the time, but because of a train strike, I couldn't get out of Central, and so I missed that opportunity. Last Friday, Alex Classens, the Secretary of the Trains, RTBU, representing the trains in New South Wales, rang me to tell me of the results of the union ballot, to let me know that there would be some changes. And I spoke to Alex about that, and he's been around long enough to still know the drivers that actually caused that dispute. So you bring some of these connections back, and it influences what we do, and it sort of influences the way we think. But we are facing quite a bit of change. I'm far more relaxed than some of my presenters today. I certainly agree with the importance of negotiating and engaging with your workforce. Having a connection with your people makes a big difference. But I do believe that unions play an important part, and they do have a role in the industrial relations system and in our workplace relations system. Unfortunately, some of the sort of more ratbag unions get all the airplay, but it was a Labor government that deregistered the BLF. It was a Labor government during the pilots dispute in 1989 that brought in the military to support passenger transit transfers around the country. And I think it was a courageous government, a Labor government, that made some transformations around the bargaining processes in the early 90s, where we've benefited from those changes through to today. I do agree, and I've known Sally McManus for 25 years, and I'll talk about that connection. I do agree that we need to make some changes, and I do unfortunately agree that there are some employers who are exceptions to the rule, who do rip people off, who celebrate that opportunity to take money from people in a far weakened position. And so we need to find a way to correct that balance. As I said, I'm not an advocate, I'm not a member of the Labor Party, but I just think keeping a perspective and a balance in forums like this is very important. I learnt on my way through my IR skills. I started in the public sector, but I did some work in the abattoirs around New South Wales. You're never more sort of brought to attention when you're dealing with boiling water, sharp knives and really cranky people. And when you work and deal with people that work in slaughterhouses, they're not shy to let you know what they think. And I know in an organisation, in an industry like yours, there's a lot of regulation, and that was the case in the meat industry in the early 90s. Some may remember the meat substitution scandal in the early 80s. There was a Royal Commission, and I guess the hottest items in the early 80s were shredding machines to get rid of a bunch of paperwork that sort of actually had led up trails of evidence of people sending horse meat overseas as cattle and sheep. Unfortunately, one of the first giveaways was when someone forgot to take the head off the carcass and actually sent a horse overseas in a container, arguing that it was beef, and that was one of the early indications that they were in a bit of trouble. But in terms of that heavy regulation, in 1991, Simon Crean, I think back then was the Minister for Agriculture, and primary industries. And the government, a Labor government, made a decision that the level of inspection for domestic meat sales, or meat for sale in the domestic market, didn't need to be at the same level of inspection for meat that was exported. So my job at the time was to go around abattoirs in New South Wales and explain to people who were third, fourth and fifth generation meat inspectors the level of quality assurance that we are now planning to provide to people in Australia was at a lower standard to people overseas. You can imagine, and the core of that process and that policy change was cost. You needed less inspectors, you took the vet out of the inspection process in domestic abattoirs, and essentially you rendered a large proportion, nearly 40% of the domestic inspection workforce was affected. Over 12 months that workforce reduced rapidly. And you talk about change, Macca, 1991, I mean we certainly tracked those folks for the 10 years following, and they did things. They became bus drivers, they became riggers, some retired, others went back to college, went back to school. And so there is hope for people in industries, and it's one of these things that I think I've certainly felt that in the room, and I've certainly felt that being part of the Downer Group, that we do need to nurture and care for people transitioning, a bit like the motor vehicle industry and others that have been impacted. But I remember one particular incident. I was at the Railway Hotel in Cowra, explaining that this level of change was important. I did have the Meat Inspectors Association representative with me, Ray Thompson. But I guess what it did for me, the response from country people, the response from anybody about, do you realise the impact of your decision? So as the agent for the organisation to explain, this is the reason for the change, nobody buys that. They expect the person in front of them to have the answers. They expect that person in front of them to know how to manage that conflict. And for me, that was the early grounds as to why I thought, no, this is an important function in businesses, to make sure that your IR people know what they're doing. It equally, I'd just like to point out, for those people who feel that the Labor Party needs to distance itself from the union movement, most of those Labor politicians have done that on the ground work. They've had that connection with people, most, not all. But that's a skill when you think about the other forms of politicians around the place. Have they had that same experience? Believe me, because it's very confronting. It's very unsettling, but it's one of those things that you grow from that conflict, you grow from that experience. But moving through from the meat industry, back to the Cowra Hotel, and this fellow said to me, do you know how much this has affected me? And then a younger bloke said, yeah, but mate, you've got to keep pace with the pace of change. And then there's a knuckle on, right? So unfortunately, you're in a pub, it's 9:30 at night, the people are full of grog, there's a punch up, and then a person back in Sydney said, well, you better go and fire those two fellas. I said, well, you can't fire them. You know, it's after hours. It was before some of those precedent decisions to say, is it a workplace or not? So the decision was made to move this one fellow, the older fellow from Cowra, down to Blaney. Now, I don't know if anybody in the room's been to Blaney, but it is the coldest joint in the state. This was the middle of winter, and other than the Goldfields motor inn, you can't find accommodation. You literally need for someone to leave the town or for someone to die. So with the union official, I went to Blaney with this fellow. We were looking for accommodation. The only place we could find was a house where a woman had passed away the week before. And of course he said, I can't live in that house, it's haunted. And so Tomo at the Meat Inspectors Association said, mate, unless you're going to find a way to prove that this place isn't haunted, you know, we can't leave him here. So at the time, I went down to the local Catholic church, established my credentials. The priest came back for $100 with some holy water, threw it around the lawn inside the house and said, it's all done. And then Tomo said, sorry mate, you're going to have to live here for the next 12 months. And then he got his way back to Cowra. But through that, I had some time after the meat industry, did some time in the Navy as a civilian. Interesting there, and that transition from around quality assurance, heavy regulation, moving into the Navy, the senior services, the Navy folks will tell you, that notion of optimising processes, minimising waste, people don't come first, processes come first. And that is, if you like, from the early 90s, that's a transition that I'm not sure the union movement got hold of quick enough in a positive way, and that would be one criticism I would have. But that notion of quality assurance or total quality management, I think it is something that once they got hold of that a bit later on, it made a bit of a difference. From the Navy I joined Qantas, and having heard the story about the grounding, I know a lot of detail about the grounding which I can't share with you, but it was a turning point. And when Albo speaks a little later, he was the Transport Minister at the time, And he, as I said, he certainly was caught in a situation which everything happened very, very quickly. But there were some very clever tactics played out by the union movement in terms of threatening industrial action lawfully, taking 1 minute of industrial action, and then the paperwork and processes that flowed for Qantas administrators to process a 1 minute pay deduction, no real impact to the employee. It virtually froze the business. That's why they acted the way they did. Well, one of the key drivers in terms of why they did what they did. But through the Qantas years, and this is where I come back to my point that the officials that are representing, or the politicians on the Labor side of politics, so many of them were working as union officials at that time. So Bill was the State Secretary in Victoria when I became Federal Secretary of the AWU. Richard Miles was with the TW and the ACTU, and a bunch of other people who were now in very senior roles and important roles from the Labor side. This is a different Labor Party to the one that came in 2007. 2007, the Labor Party had the advantage of post-work choices environment where people just thought that was just an overreach, to your point earlier. And it was just an unfortunate circumstance where whatever Tony Abbott decided at the time and whatever John Howard felt at the time, you did have Labor governments in every state. As I said, a bit of an IR nerd, I mean, I'm happy to be challenged on that, but there were Labor governments in every state for nearly 2 years in that window of work choices. So there was some frustration. And if you remember back to the COAG meetings, they could not get changes through, they couldn't drive reform. So when they had that opportunity to drive and shove work choices down people's throats, there was certainly a huge element of frustration. What it did though, from an IR perspective, it's thrown the appetite and the energy and the courage to make difficult decisions and set difficult policy settings virtually out the window. Since 2007, we are now confronting the fact that we'll have our 8th Prime Minister in just over 10 years. 8 Prime Ministers in 10 years. Now, people say you don't vote for the PM, but unfortunately you do. You do ultimately have a PM that you deserve, and you get the IR that you deserve. But what we need at the moment, and I'll come back to some further examples, we need a political party to have the courage, have the ability to have bipartisan approach to a number of things, have the ability to take some of these fringe political parties out of the play, and groups like our industry advisory groups like just individuals having conversations with politicians, we need to influence the way they think, because this is an essential service. And the notion of sitting down with lawyers either side, and no disrespect to lawyers or industry groups, but you know, the fact that we may need lawyers to interpret what we're trying to say, it doesn't lend itself. Take me back to the abattoir days. If I had a copy of the Act in the abattoir, I'll tell you where I'd finish up, and my parents wouldn't have found me again, right? You've got to have a way to connect where it resonates and where people believe you, where there's an authenticity. And certainly that's the approach that we take at Downer. I guess one other thing, so I'm from Burke. The CEO, the group CEO, Grant Fenn, a couple of you may know Grant, but Grant was originally from Tumut, went to boarding school at Goulburn, went to study economics at Macquarie, and we both started at Qantas in 1994-95. I've known him for a long time, and that is his commitment that when we look to resolve conflict, we do put people first. He's not one to be ripped off. He's not one for people to take being recorded to take the mickey out of people, but he certainly wants to be seen that we're fair and we do the right thing. The Downer business today, we're at over 300 sites. We're approaching 60,000 people. We have over 300 enterprise agreements. And when you look at the tie-up with the recently acquired Spotless, we can operate a hospital with all but the clinical staff. We don't want that. We can operate a mine site with all but the ownership, if you like, or the technical drive from the owners in a mine site. We build roads. We support venues like the MCG. We do a pile of stuff. And that revenue that we generate, about $250 to $260 million a week, it's low margin. We don't sit back and relax and think that, you know, this is something that we do easily. We have some brilliant partners with my colleagues at Keolis. We've done, I think, some good work in that space, and I think the capability and the technology and the quality of people that they bring to our business is first class. But just some other specific examples where we put that into practice. One, I'll talk about Newcastle. We weren't in the running in Newcastle initially. I think it was a great bid. I think everybody submitted fantastic bids. I know the Premier at the time and the Transport Minister liked the fact that we had a heads of agreement with the RTBU, with the AMWU. and an understanding with the maritime unions. The ASU did its usual thing. They committed to sign an MOU, but they never would. But that essentially, the guts of that agreement was we aren't planning to make anybody forcibly redundant in the next 4 years, but the trade-off for that is you won't take any form of protected industrial action for the first 6 months. Now, it's a heads of agreement. The lawyers would say, but you know, what's the effectiveness of such a document? Well, it was based on old-fashioned goodwill, openness, authenticity. We met with unions in New South Wales and all of the relevant unions. We spent 2 hours together. We established our approach and our plan, and they bought in. We trusted them, they trusted us. We haven't lost 1 minute through industrial action in the Newcastle bid. We've had struggles around different things with schedule changes and that sort of stuff, but that's part of doing business. Now, the fact that Chris Preston's been rolled as the State Secretary of the Bus Union in New South Wales, the allegations are it's around privatisation. Chris, I don't see him as a victim in this process. I think he stood up and he's demonstrated his capabilities as an individual who will put the right thing by the employees and by the business first. And the challenges that we have with the TW, well, Richard Olsen and I go back 25 years. I certainly am very familiar with those challenges. But I guess the last one for me, I want to come back to Food Bank. I know we're not taking questions, Macca, but I did want to come back to Food Bank. We talked about the train strike of January this year. Does anybody familiar or remember the Streets ice cream dispute last Christmas? Unilever? So, and this is where I want to talk about that dispute specifically. What I'm doing at Downer, and I've got one of my colleagues, Mel Hogan, here today, who's a specialist in buses, trains, and a great counsel to me. Very fortunate to have Mel with me and part of the team. But what I've done at Downer, we run our own program internally. We train our senior managers, middle managers and frontline managers in how to do, if you like, the old-fashioned way of doing IR. I'm pushing and promoting the HR people, the IR people to do their own advocacy. It's not as a challenge to lawyers doing that work or industry groups doing that work, but we've lost something, and this is where I'd urge you, and this is this bit about what I'd ask you to have a think about taking away. I would encourage, and certainly I've said to Macca, I'm more than happy to use my team in any way that would support this group, not in any sort of profit motive, but in a way to sort of just build this momentum. We need to get back to doing IR the old-fashioned way. We need to have people representing the business as advocates in the Commission. We need people to understand how to resolve complex problems, because about 25 years ago, the HR profession, my own profession, derided the IR capability to the point where they just said, look, IR's for Neanderthals, all the sneaky stuff done in back rooms, in smoke-filled rooms and backyards of pubs, all this sort of stuff. We'll give that to law firms, we'll give that to industry groups, and essentially there has been a generation of missed capability build or capability development in this IR space, which we need to reconnect with. I don't think it's at the expense of what the work lawyers do or industry groups, but it builds confidence. When I first joined Qantas, we did that. We took back, if you like, what was a long-standing government-owned organisation where the unions just ran right in the joint. We dealt to that issue. But what we're doing at Downer, and it's best described as I've stopped our negotiators going into negotiations on their knees, apologising for something they haven't done. Our people go into the room with confidence, with a capability, with a clear agenda, but with a willingness and openness to listen to people and be authentic. This essential service piece is critical, but equally you need to have advocates and people in your business that know what they're doing. So we've trained nearly 350 people. We run the program with groups of 20 to 30 people, but it is about building that capability and making sure that people understand what's required and how to make their way through problems. And it gets to a point where arguably arbitration or some sort of external assistance is going to be required. But just back to Unilever for a moment. So I did the same thing at previous organisations, and at one stage, Komatsu and a few other places, but I worked at Goodman Fielder, HR director, and we did fresh bread. 25 to 30,000 customers every night. If you imagine, all of that work that's done to get the bread out on the day that it's baked and that sort of thing. And I worked for a chap there, Clive Stiff, who went on to become CEO and chairman of Unilever Australia and New Zealand, a little after I left and joined Komatsu. And we did this training, and an expression I do use in the training is you've got to be mindful of taking yourself into an IR cul-de-sac. And you hit a point where you've gone in without an exit strategy. When he rang me November last year and said, I need some help, I need some assistance, I've taken the business into an IR cul-de-sac. And I said, well, I sort of was across a bit of the detail. But basically, there was a manufacturing plant out of Minto in Western Sydney. very old-fashioned. There were 2 production lines. If someone fell sick on one production line, you couldn't move people across. You had to bring someone in on overtime. AMWU territory, so Steve Murphy, new State Secretary. But Unilever, they went straight to the Horizon solution. They got to a point after about 6 weeks of negotiations where they said, well, we're going to terminate the enterprise agreement. Back then, there was a high level of confidence that the Conservatives would probably win government in 2019. And so the notion of going to terminate enterprise agreements, people were less concerned about the change the rules or the Sally McManus machine, but it became the poster child of the change the rules campaign, Streets, Unilever. The issue for Clive, and you know, when you think a dispute is local and you can handle things, I think it's lovely that people, they get out of their normal routine and they think, I can handle this, what's the worst that can happen? There might be a little bit of a flashpoint, some strikes in my facility. Sally McManus got hold of Sharon Burrows. The Unilever supply chain globally was about to shut down. Now, if you think about what Unilever do and Sharon Burrows' role in the international union scene, they were working arrangements to basically bring Unilever to its knees. Now, Unilever have got separate issues at the moment about their FTSE listing and a whole lot of stuff, but at the time, Clive was getting pressure from head office to say, what on earth are you doing? So he reached out and he said he wanted some support, and we provided that. And essentially, I got people assembled. I assembled a group of people, but we had the Unilever rep, we had Steve Murphy, we had Bernie Reardon, who was the commissioner going through the interest-based bargaining approach, and myself, and we worked through a solution. The solution was good old-fashioned conversation. There were raised voices, there were finger-poking, there was approaches where this notion of threatening to terminate the agreement, it just came out of nowhere. There needed to be an acknowledgement that that simply wasn't going to be the case. So in the end, we got a result. I got a lovely note from Clive. I get no credit from the union for that, nor do I expect it, but they acknowledged that it was a process that needed some intervention. And under the Old Mates Act, I didn't take any money for that, nor should we, but Unilever are very good contributors to Food Bank. And that Christmas, a lot of families, believe me, there, but for the grace of God go any of us, a lot of families that need Food Bank for support, they got access to some very expensive ice creams that Mum and Dad would never ever be able to pay for in a normal context. And so, you know, that to me, it just brings back the rewards, the ability to apply, if you like, some learnings that I've acquired over many years, some fantastic mentors, both from the union side and from non-union side. But that is something, when we come back to essential services, we need to build our capability in-house. So as I said, I'm not trying to put the lawyers or the industry groups out of business. There are some industry groups not represented here today who have absolutely made it clear that they think the Labor Party will lose next year. I think that's wrong. I think it'll be very, very close. And we're certainly on an election footing potentially before Christmas. But from my perspective, transport is an essential service, but I would urge you, when you leave today, think about Food Bank in any one of your states. If you feel there's an opportunity to support, we'd certainly appreciate it. Middle class poverty and food insecurity is a huge issue in Australia, We support 220,000 families every week. 50% of those people that we support are children under 10, where there's no plan to provide a meal for a child any day of the week. Any day of the week. There's flat screens in those homes, there's beers in the fridge, they'll have a punt on the tab, they'll have a smoke, and all they've left in the house is a loaf of bread, half a bottle of milk and some Vegemite in the cupboard, and they think, look, if the kids can't look after themselves, go to your mate's place and have a feed. It's a huge issue. But on that note, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. I think a huge opportunity in this industry, Macca. I appreciate the chance to sort of present, and I'd certainly, in the break, be happy to take any questions or feedback from people. Thank you.